not accepted by you. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. O my Lord Nrsimhadev, O Supreme, because of a bodily conception of life, embodied souls neglected and not cared for by you cannot do anything for their betterment. Whatever remedies they accept, although perhaps temporarily beneficial, are certainly impermanent. For example, a father and mother cannot protect their child. A physician and medicine cannot relieve a suffering patient, and a boat on the ocean cannot protect a drowning man. Phrase by phrase. Repeat. My Lord Nrsimhadev, O Supreme, because of a bodily conception of life, embodied souls, neglected and not cared for by you, cannot do anything for the betterment. Whatever remedies they accept, although perhaps temporarily beneficial, are certainly impermanent. For example, a father and mother cannot protect their child. A physician and medicine cannot relieve a suffering patient. And a boat on the ocean cannot protect a drowning man. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Through parental care, through remedies for different kinds of disease, and through means of protection on the water, in the air, and on land, there is always an endeavor for relief from various kinds of suffering in the material world. But none of them are guaranteed measures for protection. They may be beneficial temporarily, but they afford no permanent benefit. Despite the presence of a father and mother, a child cannot be protected from accidental death, disease, and various other miseries. No one can help, including the parents. Ultimately, the shelter is the Lord, and one who takes shelter of the Lord is protected. This is guaranteed. As the Lord says in Bhagavad Gita, Kunteya patijanihi name bhakta pranashyati. O son of Kunti, declare it boldly that my devotee never perishes. Therefore, unless one is protected by the mercy of the Lord, no remedial measure can act effectively. One should consequently depend fully on the causeless mercy of the Lord. Although, as a matter of routine duty, one must of course accept other remedial measures, no one can protect one who is neglected by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In this material world, everyone is trying to counteract the onslaught of material nature, but everyone is ultimately fully controlled by material nature. Therefore, even though so-called philosophers and scientists try to surmount the onslaught of material nature, they have not been able to do so. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita 13.9 that the real sufferings of the material world are four: Janma, Mrityu, Jara, Vyadhi, birth, death, old age, and disease. In the history of the world, no one has been successful in conquering these miseries imposed by material nature. Prakrite kriyamanani gunaya karmani sarvashaha. Nature, Prakriti, is so strong that no one can overcome her stringent laws. So-called scientists, philosophers, religionists, and politicians should therefore conclude that they cannot offer facilities to the people in general. They should make vigorous propaganda to awaken the populace and raise them to the platform of Krishna consciousness. Our humble attempt to propagate the Krishna consciousness movement all over the world is the only remedy that can bring about a peaceful and happy life. We can never be happy without the mercy of the Supreme Lord, Tvadupekshitana. If we keep displeasing our Supreme Father, we shall never be happy within this material world, in either the upper or lower planetary systems. Translation again. O my Lord Nrsimhadev, O Supreme, because of a bodily conception of life, embodied souls neglected, not cared for you, cannot do anything for their betterment. Whatever remedies they accept, although perhaps temporarily beneficial, are certainly impermanent. For example, a father and mother cannot protect their child. A physician and medicine cannot relieve a suffering patient. And a boat on the ocean cannot protect a drowning man. This form of Nrsimhadev is very fierce, and because he has the aspect of a lion, people are often very afraid. In other so-called Greek mythology and other writings, there are beings that are half animal and half man, like the centaurs and other people that are half horse and half man, like that. But when one is half lion and half man, that is a very fearful form. So, because of many advances, people are lured into a kind of a false sense of security. They think, oh, by the way, this is not my usual appearance, but this is a combination of a class and a photo shoot. I have to look a little bit different for this photograph. But ordinarily, I don't like this kind of look. Anyway, I have to look a little bit older, so at least has some white. And I'm 73 years old, but I don't look that old. Anyway, the hair on top is not white. So the hair on this part is partly white anyway. So these remedies are only temporary. And because of many advances, there are many advances in the fields of medicine, communication, and travel. In the fields of medicine, it's thought sometimes that people can live almost forever, for hundreds of years. I read one article in a Newsweek magazine that said that maybe by replacing hearts and other parts of the body that people could live for maybe 200 or 300 years. But the article also said that so far they haven't invented anything to replace the brain. This means that maybe 200 or 300-year-old people would be walking around, those that can afford to replace all the bodily parts, would be walking around, but they would have no memory. They'd be just like robots. They'd have no brain. They would be unable to think. And because of advances in medicine, we can just take a pill and think that we'll be okay. Pharmaceutical companies, one of the biggest businesses in the world, by the way, advertises the tablets and capsules. I don't know if any of you have been to New York, but there are a lot of advertisements in the subways. If you look on the upper part of the subway, they advertise a lot. They advertise a tablet for almost every kind of ailment. There's headaches, there's leg aches, there's arm aches, there's indigestion, there's nausea. All this can be cured simply by taking a tablet. In some parts of the world, medicine has been able to extend a person's life even for maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years or more. So people think that this is a very great advancement. This is part of the false sense of security. I say false sense of security because no scientist or doctor has ever been able to conquer the death experience. People can maybe live to be 100 years old or 120 or 130. But at some point they have to leave that material body. But because we can get things fixed very easily just by taking a tablet or having an operation or going into hospital for a few days or a few weeks, we think that everything is going to be okay, but it's actually not going to be okay. The fact is that we have to experience old age, we have to experience suffering, and at some point we have to, I know this sounds a little bit fatalistic, but at some point we just have to die. It's inevitable. And then there's communication, because we can just pick up a telephone and talk to someone on the other side of the world. We think that's a very wonderful thing. In a sense, it is a great thing. And it was predicted even about 500 years ago that such things would be invented. Francis Bacon and other people predicted the technology would advance to the point where we could just, by picking up a device, talk to someone thousands of miles away as if they were face to face with us. We think that's a very wonderful thing, but there are also difficulties. Medicine has toxic side effects sometimes. Communication, there's plane crashes in travel. Because we can travel. That's another thing. We can go to the other side of the world, thousands of miles away, just by purchasing an air ticket. And it's a very common thing in the United States for people to travel by airplane. So they think this is a very wonderful thing. I'm flying in an airplane. I'm 10 or 20,000 meters into the air. This is a very wonderful thing. We're advancing. We're making a lot of progress by flying like the birds in the air, way up high. It's a wonderful thing. So this is part of the false sense of security, to think that this is a form of advancement, that I can fly in the sky. In just a few hours, I can go to the other side of the world. Whereas if I were walking or taking a bullock cart or a horse cart, it might take days or months or years. So this is a very wonderful thing. Travel, communications, medicine. So this is a sense of how we're allured into a sense of false security. And in the purport, Prabhupada talks about remedial measures. There's all kinds of disclaimers. You buy a drug or food, it says that it may contain traces of this or contain traces of that, or maybe you're allergic to this or allergic to that. And somehow these people that make the food or whatever, or cans or whatever it is that you buy, seem to think that they can be not blamed for anything that might happen to you. You might get food poisoning, you might die, but there's all kinds of remedial measures that can be. Maybe you have to go and see your physician. Maybe you have to vomit. Maybe you have to rinse your eyes out with water. Whatever it is, it's only temporary. It's a remedial measure, but it's only temporary. So there are many types of things that appear to be advancing us, and many things that appear to be wonderful. And they are, in a sense, very wonderful, but no one has been able to, as Prabhupada says in the purport, to conquer over Janma, Mrityu, Jarabadi, the old age, death, birth, and growth. Janma, Mrityu, death, birth, death, old age, and disease have never really been, they can be partially conquered, but they've never been really conquered. In the history of human beings, they've never been totally conquered. We all have to experience them. And I don't know if we have time, but I want to talk a little bit about plagiarism. Our tradition is very different, and one of the things that's wonderful about Prahlad Maharaj is that he relied on, he is called a Nitya Siddha, or an eternally liberated person. He relied on things that had gone before. It's said in the Shastras, in the various Vedic writings, that one has to take advice from those that have gone before. So we can stand on the shoulders of great men and see great things in the future. But in many parts of the world, especially in academia, it's considered a very great offense to be influenced by someone else or to rely upon someone else. In many cases, things there's a saying that we have to rely upon the great souls, or the Mahajans, and there's a list of who are the Mahajans, and Prahlad Maharaj is one of them. They're great people who had vision, who could see, who were very spiritually realized. In New Zealand, they have a thing called a bush telegraph, and I think they call it Chinese whisper in this country, or you whisper something or you say something to the person next to you, and after it's passed through the minds of about 30 or 40 people, it comes out to be completely different from the original message. What happens with Vedic knowledge is that we rely on the purity of the people that are passing things down. This is called the stiplet succession. And this way, a message, even though it's passed down over many hundreds of years through many different people, it's not changed. It preserves its original purity, its original force. And this happens because the people who pass on the message are pure in heart. It's a kind of unusual thing, and kind of a unique thing, but it really does happen. And one of the things that's very important is that Prabhupada relied upon written messages. sometimes, very often, he was up very late at night writing his books, translating his books. In some other religions, the writings are in another language, and some of them you don't even tell what language that was. One thing that was interesting about Prabhupada is that he liked the Sanskrit language, and he studied the Sanskrit language. And it's said that it may take many lifetimes to master Sanskrit grammar. It's such a difficult language. Of course, it's the mother tongue of many languages. We have mata in Sanskrit, mater in Latin, and mother in English, and many other words we can find many other origins in the Sanskrit language. Prabhupada was up very late at night translating works that were written in Sanskrit, like the Srimad Bhagavatam. These are I don't know if you can see them, but the Devanagari texts, they're a little bit difficult to master, to learn, but one can learn to read them. But the grammar is very difficult. And there's people that have studied for 2 or 3 years, and so they've just barely touched on what it really is. Even material knowledge requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of repetition and a lot of humility. Once Prabhupada quoted Sir Isaac Newton, who was considered one of the greatest physicists of all time, at least up until Einstein and the theory of relativity. And Newton was quoted as saying that what knowledge do I have? I've gathered a few grains from the big beach. So part of, and this is written down in the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, that humility, Amivan, is one of the symptoms of knowledge, that one can gain knowledge if one thinks that one doesn't know anything. Then it is easier to gain knowledge from others and other people. Prabhupada was up very late at night translating his books, and at one point he said that he didn't want to do any more managing of ISKCON. He only wanted to write books. This was in Los Angeles in 1973. Prabhupada said that he just wanted to dedicate his life to books. And when in addition to this book, which is a many-volume set, Srimad Bhagavatam, he translated Chaitanya Chaitamrita. He asked his production staff to produce the whole Chaitanya Chaitamrita, which is available in its many volumes. It's a very large work, including all the commentaries and purports that Prabhupada has written. He asked them to produce all these books in a 6-week period, and he was told that this was impossible to do because it required proofreading, it required publishing, it required a lot of editing, and pictures had to be inserted in all the books. But somehow it was done. Prabhupada is on record as saying that impossible is a word in a fool's dictionary. But it was done, and it's probably never been done before by anyone else, but there was a staff of people, and they were including painters. Sometimes these painters weren't finished with their paintings, and they were removed while they were still in progress because they had to be published by a certain date. And some of the artists were very disturbed by this, but it happened. And as a result, this multi-volume set of books was published. So Prabhupada considered the written word to be very important. There's a bit of history. I don't think we have time to go into the history of why the written word is important, but it is important. It was important hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Although people they could memorize, they were much more adept at hearing and memorizing than they are now. They also relied a lot upon writings. Writings in those days were mostly done on palm leaves and pieces of tree bark, and they were somehow or other bound together. But even so, people had great memories, and especially the Brahminical class of people. There was a case, I think this is not narrated in one of the books, but it's something that really happened. I think this was narrated by Prabhupada. There was a case, I think it was somewhere in India, where two people had an argument, and it resulted in one murdering the other one. So this happened sometime before 1937, I think, when the British were ruling India. So this went to court, and there were no witnesses, so it was very difficult to determine who was right and who was wrong in this murder case. But then a witness was found. The witness was an elderly Brahmin man. Somehow he was like a carryover from a previous age. He could remember everything, even though he had no idea what language they were speaking. He remembered everything that they said. And his testimony as a witness was admitted into the court. And as a result of his testimony, a judgment was made, a final judgment was made about this. People in previous ages could very easily hear things and memorize them. There's a concept of someone called a Shrutidar. That's a person who remembers everything that's is heard. Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, is sometimes known as the walking encyclopedia. He could remember everything. He could read an entire dictionary and remember every word. And there's a biography of Prabhupada's spiritual master. And in it, it's in 3 volumes. At the end of each volume, it said, Guide to Obscure Words. Obscure English words. Guide to Obscure English Words. He remembered all these very unusual words from, I suppose, from reading a dictionary. So even in his not autobiography, in his biography, it had to be mentioned that there was a section for, you sort of, to read Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's works in English, you almost have to have a dictionary alongside the book. It's so difficult to read. Even Prabhupada didn't encourage us to read his books. They were written to show that the British rulers of India in his time, it was before 1937, were very intelligent, and that they weren't just people who chanted on the street in pink bed sheets, but they were knowledgeable. Anyway, there's a whole history of writing. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that even though devotees took vows to follow regulated principles and to chant 16 rounds before the deities, before Prabhupada, before the sacred fire, and before the Vaishnavas, Prabhupada sent a letter out to all his temple presidents. I know this because I was a temple president. I got one of these letters. The letter had to be signed and returned to Prabhupada, and it was a written vow to follow the 4 regulated principles and to chant the Hare Krishna mantra 16 times every day, 16 rounds every day of the Hare Krishna mantra. So I'm going a little bit over time. Are there any comments or questions or reflections or realizations anyone wants to say? Yes?
You mentioned this very letter that Prabhupada sent out, and then in class you're emphasising the written word and this knowledge has been passed down. It doesn't seem that there's much emphasis on that as you do these other principles and chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. Is there any reason for that? Why it's not like a vow or a
Any reason why it should be documented, you mean?
I'm saying there's not so much emphasis on following the 4 regular principles and chanting 16 rounds. It seems like the rest of it, like 2 important factors like kirtan and studying the scriptures is individual to do or not do, so to speak. It seems that they're very, very important and depend on each other.
Well, I think Prabhupada has written that one has to learn to love Krishna. That's the most important. Always remember Krishna and never forget him. But that supersedes all of the regulated principles. If one can remember Krishna and never forget him. And that's written in the Nectar of Devotion, and it's also reiterated in the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Chaitanya Chaitamrita. The process of chanting 16 rounds and following regulated principles is sometimes known as Vaidhi or sadhana. And the example is given. An example is given in the Chaitanya Charitamrita that this is a kind of, the Vaidhi Bhakti or Sadhana Bhakti is a kind of practice. And he used the example in the Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila, I think it's in the 23rd or 22nd chapter, of learning how to type with a typewriter. It's kind of grueling and drudgery. When you first learn how to type, you just have to put your hands on the keys and maybe you don't know what they are. You're not supposed to look. And it's very difficult. But after a while, you can type very easily and very fast. You can, even while a person's speaking, you can type 70 or 80, what they call words per minute, and type so fast. And it's the same thing with playing like a musical keyboard, like a harmonium or a piano. It's very difficult and very full of grueling and drudgery practice. You don't like to do it, but after a while, you become very fluent and very good at it. You don't even have to look. You just can play the piano or type on the typewriter very fluently without. So the idea is that this practicing eventually becomes spontaneous love. Practice, there's a saying in English, practice makes perfect. So if you practice a thing and it's not very pleasant, you do it, you force yourself to do it because ultimately you can do it spontaneously. You have a feeling for doing it. And it's the same with everything, with writing, with publishing books. By learning the art of how to do something, it's difficult and very unpleasant at first, but after a while practice becomes spontaneous love. I think there's a description of this in Nectar of Devotion, how sadhana or regulative practices become spontaneous, and sadhana becomes what's called raganuga bhakti. Learn to love Krishna. It's not something that you just do spontaneously the first time, like love at first sight. There's a kind of practice involved, and learning to love Krishna there's a learning curve. It's not an automatic thing. It's kind of like love at first sight is kind of like a sentimental thing. It doesn't happen with Krishna anyway. And even when it happens in the material world, it often ends in disaster. I hate to be blunt, but that's the fact. Any other comments? It doesn't have to be about this verse, just about anything you want to talk about. Yes?
Can you tell us about this photo shoot what it's for?
The photo shoot, while he's taking a lot of pictures, is for this thing called the 50th anniversary. There's a magazine attached to it. And the magazine is to show that after 50 years, there's been a certain amount of progress. So the reason that I'm trying to look old is that I'm going to be pictured on the cover with a number of other people, but that's the reason. Yes?
Maharaj, I want to thank you for the nice class, and to thank you for being there in London when I came and teaching to me, and for all the years of your service to Prabhupada.
You're quite welcome.
And I just remember the loving relationship between you and Srila Prabhupada. One morning, Darshan, when he came in 71, you were working, and we were having Darshan with Prabhupada, and you said, Srila Prabhupada, can I be excused? And Prabhupada looked up and said, oh, you have to go? And you said, yes, I need to go to work. And Prabhupada said, you will be back this evening? And you said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And it was just so sweet. You had a very wonderful relationship with Srila Prabhupada.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of an incident that concerns Jayananda Prabhupada, the late Jayananda Prabhupada. He had been working on the Rath Yatra carts in San Francisco, and he was full of grease, and he'd been up all night the night before, and somehow or other he was convinced to attend a darshan. It was an audience with Prabhupada. And he was so exhausted that even while Prabhupada was talking, he was starting to fall asleep. This happened about 2 or 3 times, and the devotees who were in the darshan thought that Prabhupada hadn't noticed this. And each time that he started to nod off, the person next to him kind of nudged him, and he sat up straight as if he was correcting himself for being very sinful. And when it happened the 4th time, he started to nod off, and this person was poking him in the ribs with his elbow. Prabhupada said, leave him alone. He pointed his finger at the person who was nudging him. He said, he is doing more work than all of you combined. That really happened. At least that's the story. Hare Krishna. Yes?
Got a couple of boys here from Michael Group or an artist, 2 young boys.
Very good. Why did you come here anyway? I mean, it's going into winter, but it is a little bit warmer. Yes?
The story, I hear the story, another story coming to mind, and it's conflicting. Prabhupada one day chastised his disciple falling asleep in his class, and he said, if you're very serious of Krishna consciousness, you never fall asleep in the class. chastise like that.
So to avoid falling asleep in class, one has to get to rest very early at night. Because I've started to fall asleep in Prabhupada's class because I had been up the night before, all night. Sometimes it happens. But I think what you said is true, that if you're really in love with Krishna, you wouldn't fall asleep. You'd just be so eager to hear about the pastimes of Krishna that you wouldn't fall asleep when Prabhupada was talking. Thank you. So I think we'll stop there. And the breakfast is moving out. Hare Krishna.